At 3:17 in the morning, the phone rang with a threat sharp enough to cut through the silence of the presidential office. 48 hours, that was the demand, to erase decisions, to restore foreign contracts, to surrender sovereignty. It was not a negotiation, it was an ultimatum. But the man on the other end of the line miscalculated. He thought fear would bend a leader. He thought pressure would erase a nation's dignity. He thought the clock would tick only towards submission. Instead, it began ticking towards something else entirely. Defiance, clarity, and the birth of resistance. Stay with us, because this is not just another headline. It is the sound of history shifting beneath our feet. Subscribe and keep walking with this story. In the shadows of Ouagadougou, a young captain turned president listened, not with panic, but with steel in his voice. And a question echoed across the darkness. What happens when a small, landlocked nation refuses to bow to the will of a superpower? The answer would unfold minute by minute, hour by hour, as the countdown towards 48 hours began. The hour was unearthly, the silence broken only by the ringing of a secure line. At 3:17 in the morning, Ibrahim Traoré, the young soldier turned president of Burkina Faso, lifted the receiver. On the other end was a voice he recognized at once. Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, cold, clipped, and sharp as steel. The words came not as suggestions, not as diplomacy, but as dictates. Restore mining contracts revoked months before. Reopen the surveillance arrangements that had been terminated. Reverse every single decision that had injured Israeli interests. And do it within 48 hours. If not, the choices were exile or surrender. There are calls that carry the weight of centuries. For a small, landlocked nation of 22 million people, this was one of them. The ultimatum was clear: bow or be broken. Yet as the line went dead, Traoré did not collapse beneath the pressure. He stared into the darkness of his office and felt not fear but clarity. If submission was the price of survival, then survival itself was an empty prize. The minutes that followed were decisive. He did what soldiers do when threatened. He assembled his command. By 4 o'clock, his closest circle had been summoned to the crisis room. The defense minister, the intelligence chief, the foreign affairs advisor, men who had followed him through the tumult of the Sahel and into the presidency. Traoré placed a small device on the table, pressed play, and Netanyahu's voice filled the room. Demands disguised as diplomacy, threats wrapped in the language of partnership. The silence that followed was long, heavy, suffocating. It was the defense minister who broke it first. This is not about contracts. This is not about surveillance. This is regime change. The intelligence chief nodded gravely. They had already observed unusual activity, satellite imagery focusing on strategic sites, cyber probes scratching at the digital walls of state systems, money flowing into untraceable accounts. The pattern was unmistakable: preparation for destabilization. The foreign affairs advisor, more cautious, voiced what the others hesitated to say. Step down. Hand power to a more acceptable figure. Preserve your life, perhaps even escape safely. The words hung in the air like smoke. But Traoré's response came instantly, sharp and unyielding. Never. To accept the ultimatum would be to confirm the very assumption behind it, that Africa still knelt when commanded. Instead, Traoré walked to the map on the wall, his finger tracing the outline of Burkina Faso. No nuclear arsenal, no powerful navy, no global corporations. Only soil, only people, only dignity. To many it would seem weakness. To him, it was the seed of something unmeasurable. Sometimes refusal is enough, he murmured, turning back to his counsel. The options were grim. Accept and preserve a fragile personal safety at the expense of national pride. Resist and invite the fury of a state far stronger in wealth, weapons, and influence. Yet there was a third option, hidden in the folds of history: to resist not as an isolated nation but as part of a wider struggle. The room understood at once. If they were to survive, they would need allies, not as clients, but as partners in resistance. Outside the walls of that council chamber, the city of Ouagadougou still slept, unaware that the fate of their sovereignty was being measured in hours. But within, decisions were being laid that would ripple far beyond the capital, far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. The countdown had begun, and every tick of the clock tightened the noose or strengthened the resolve, depending on who held the courage to face it. Traoré did not see himself as a hero, nor as a martyr. He saw himself as a sentinel guarding soil soaked with the sweat of generations who had tilled and defended it before him. That night, as his advisors debated options, He chose words that would define the 48 hours ahead. They believe this is 1960, he said. They believe we still leap when foreign men whistle. But they are wrong. This time we will not kneel. It was the seed of defiance, planted in the small hours of the morning, watered not by certainty of victory, but by refusal to surrender. And like every seed, its growth would depend on storms as much as on sunlight. As the first hour of the ultimatum expired, the question loomed, could a small landlocked nation, without weapons of mass destruction or economic might, truly defy the command of a superpower? The first 20 hours of the ultimatum were consumed by a whirlwind of calls that cut across continents. Caracas answered first. Nicolas Maduro listened in silence before replying with unexpected solidarity, political sanctuary if needed. Tehran followed, promises of cyber protection if Israeli hackers targeted the country's fragile digital systems. Moscow responded with guarded assurance, military advisors if escalation became unavoidable. Beijing, ever calculated, suggested economic lifelines to offset the inevitable withdrawal of Western investment. Each call was more than strategy. Each call was a declaration that the young president of a small African nation would not face the storm alone. The council looked on in astonishment. For decades, African leaders had often chosen silence, compromise, or retreat when confronted by external pressure. Yet here was a man who dialed foreign capitals not to plead, but to announce refusal. By hour 20, Traore had built something Netanyahu had not foreseen, a web of resistance stretching from South America to Asia. But even that was not the true surprise. The true surprise came from his own people. News of the ultimatum leaked into the streets of Ouagadougou, not through government channels, but from Israeli sources eager to boast of their leverage. By dawn, the story was everywhere. Radio stations repeated the demand. Within 48 hours, either restore Israeli contracts or step down. What might have been intended to provoke fear instead ignited fury. Crowds swelled outside the presidential palace. They did not gather to urge compromise. They gathered to demand defiance. Traore stays, they chanted. Our minerals are not Israeli property. Hand-painted signs rose above the sea of voices. 48 hours? Try 48 years. What foreign strategists had miscalculated was simple. They had underestimated the pride of ordinary citizens. At hour 30, Netanyahu called again. His voice was cold, his words clinical. 18 hours left. He warned that the people of Burkina Faso should not suffer for their president's pride. But this time Traore was ready. Calm, unshaken, he replied, "You forgot to ask my people if they wanted a new president." As he spoke, chants outside his window echoed the answer. The defiance of the crowd transformed the ultimatum into a rallying cry. This was no longer the isolation of one man against a superpower. It was a battle for the soul of a nation. Yet defiance came at a price. Hour 36 marked the beginning of the real assault. It did not come with tanks or aircraft. It came with invisible weapons. Banking systems crashed, threatening the fragile economy. Power grids flickered and failed, plunging neighborhoods into darkness. Communications wavered under relentless jamming. More dangerous still, disinformation flooded the digital sphere. Fabricated documents claimed the president had millions hidden abroad. Staged videos circulated of officials demanding his resignation. Foreign media headlines warned of authoritarianism, of democratic collapse, of a young captain turning tyrant. The attacks were not only on infrastructure, they were on legitimacy. The strategy was clear. Weaken the trust between leader and people. Fracture the bond that gave him strength. But the countermeasures were swift. Backup networks kept essential systems alive. Distributed generators steadied the grid. Encrypted channels carried orders where open lines failed. And within minutes, fake videos were exposed, forged documents unmasked. Each attack, intended to sow fear, instead bred resilience. Still, the pressure mounted. The intelligence chief entered the crisis room with grim news. They are not only attacking you, they are attacking the very idea that African nations can say no. On the screen behind him, Western headlines scrolled in unison. African authoritarianism on the rise. The dangerous precedent of anti-Western leaders. It was a coordinated blitz designed to isolate, delegitimize, and intimidate. And yet something else was taking shape. Calls began arriving not only from Caracas or Moscow, but from Bamako, Niamey, Accra, and N'Djamena. African leaders, often divided, began to recognize the peril as their own. If they can remove you, said Mali's president, they can remove any of us. Niger's parliament passed a resolution condemning foreign interference. Ghana announced an emergency African Union session. Chad placed its military command on alert. The ultimatum meant for one leader was becoming a continental alarm. By hour 42, a tide had turned. Netanyahu's effort to isolate Traore had instead unified Africa. From dusty villages to crowded capitals, the cry was the same: sovereignty is not negotiable. The stage was set for confrontation. With 6 hours left, the streets outside the palace surged with voices. Some came with drums, others with flags, all with the determination that Burkina Faso's fate would not be written in a foreign capital. The noise rose like a storm. It was no longer merely support for a president. It was a declaration of continental dignity. As the clock inched towards the final hours, one question reverberated through the night. Would defiance be enough when the ultimatum expired, or would the storm finally break? The first casualties of defiance were not soldiers or politicians. They were shopkeepers, drivers, students, and farmers who woke to find banks paralyzed and payments suspended. Markets slowed, wages went unpaid, and rumors spread faster than grain across the Sahel wind. In Ouagadougou's central market, a woman selling millet looked at the darkened stalls around her and shook her head. "They think we will panic," she murmured. But panic is their weapon, not ours. In neighborhoods where lights flickered and power outages stretched into hours, candles burned on porches as families gathered to listen to battery-powered radios. What they heard was not fear but anger. Callers flooded local stations. "We are tired of being treated like colonies," said one man. "If they can remove our president today, they will remove our children's tomorrow." The voice of the people became the counterweight to economic warfare. Yet hardship was undeniable. Traders struggled as communications faltered, hospitals relied on generators, and students lost access to online lectures. It was the lived reality of resistance. Dignity came at a cost. Still, instead of retreat, the hardship bred resilience. Communities organized food sharing. Civil society groups mobilized to counter fake news. Citizens themselves became guardians of legitimacy, debunking false reports with the same urgency as government agencies. Inside the presidential palace, the atmosphere shifted. The pressure meant to destabilize Ibrahim Traoré's authority had the opposite effect. His circle closed ranks, his political legitimacy solidified. Ministers who once worried privately about Western sanctions now voiced public commitment. Soldiers patrolling the capital reported that civilians offered them water, bread, and blessings. Defiance had turned into cohesion. But if solidarity grew at home, hostility thickened abroad. Western outlets splashed headlines across their front pages. Authoritarian drift in West Africa. Dangerous populism in Ouagadougou. A coup by another name. The irony was bitter. A president resisting foreign ultimatums was painted as undemocratic, while external attempts at regime change were framed as defending democracy. It was not journalism, it was narrative warfare. The phrase Ibrahim Traoré Coup began circulating widely, not as a description of the original transition in Burkina Faso, but as a weaponized label, a linguistic attempt to delegitimize his defiance. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, that phrase was repurposed. Graffiti appeared on walls. "If dignity is a coup, then we stand with it." Students scribbled on placards, "Better a coup of sovereignty than a surrender of freedom." Language meant to diminish became fuel for resistance. The ripple spread beyond borders. In Mali, public squares filled with chants echoing those of Burkina Faso, "Our sovereignty is not for sale." In Niger, parliamentary debates turned fiery as legislators declared that interference in Ouagadougou was interference everywhere. Ghana's assembly passed resolutions denouncing political ultimatums against African states. The continent, long described as fragmented, was discovering the strange power of a shared threat. At the African Union headquarters, discussions turned urgent. Diplomats who once hesitated to criticize external powers began speaking plainly. "If they succeed in Ouagadougou," warned one ambassador, "every presidency on this continent becomes conditional." What had begun as a national standoff was becoming a continental doctrine. Back in Burkina Faso, the social fabric was stretched but not broken. Yes, queues at petrol stations lengthened. Yes, households rationed flour and rice. But people found strength in collective refusal. It was not merely about Traoré. It was about every grandmother who remembered colonial taxes, every youth who dreamed of working on African soil rather than emigrating, every farmer who believed his harvest should feed his own community first. Resistance had moved from palace corridors into everyday life. A tailor in Bobo Dioulasso stitched slogans of defiance into cloth. Teachers explained to pupils why electricity was unreliable, and why their patience mattered for the dignity of the nation. Musicians turned chants from the streets into verses, their rhythms filling the night air. Sovereignty was no longer an abstract word. It was something tasted in hunger, felt in darkness, sung in songs, and defended with pride. Yet questions loomed over the horizon. Could this solidarity outlast the immediate crisis? Could an economy already fragile bear the weight of sanctions and sabotage? Could unity forged in resistance survive when daily struggles grew heavier? For Traore and his council, these questions were unavoidable. In the crisis room, as advisors mapped scenarios on whiteboards, the president stood silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke words that carried the gravity of centuries. We can endure hunger for a season, but if we surrender, we condemn our children to hunger forever. The ultimatum, intended as a countdown to collapse, had become a crucible. Out of it was being forged a new definition of strength, not measured in wealth or weapons, but in the willingness to suffer for dignity. As the continent's eyes turned towards Ouagadougou, one question lingered. Would this defiance remain a spark of the moment, or would it ignite a fire that redefined Africa's place in the world? The 48-hour ultimatum did not remain confined to Ouagadougou. Within days, the tremors reached Addis Ababa, Brussels, Washington, and beyond. Diplomats struggled to find language that could both acknowledge Israel's demands and avoid appearing complicit in regime change. It was a delicate dance, the language of neutrality masking the weight of geopolitical preference. At the African Union headquarters, the debate was fiery. For decades, sessions had been filled with careful phrasing and cautious appeals to international partners. But this time, ambassadors spoke with unusual bluntness. If they remove him today, warned Mali's representative, then tomorrow it will be us. Niger's envoy raised a fist in defiance. This is not Burkina Faso's battle alone. It is the test of our entire continent. The AU called an emergency session, unprecedented in both speed and tone, and began drafting a statement that would treat any forced removal of Traore as an attack on African sovereignty itself. Meanwhile, ECOWAS faced an uncomfortable dilemma. Known for intervening in West African crises, it was now confronted with a case where foreign interference, not internal instability, threatened democracy. Some leaders urged caution, fearing sanctions from Western donors. Others argued that silence would legitimize external ultimatums. Slowly, consensus emerged that the principle at stake was larger than Burkina Faso, the right of African states to choose their leaders without coercion. Across the Atlantic, reactions diverged. In Washington, officials spoke of deep concern over democratic backsliding, carefully sidestepping the reality that it was a foreign ultimatum undermining democracy. The European Union echoed similar sentiments, emphasizing stability while hinting at possible economic consequences. In Tel Aviv, the government's silence was telling. What had begun as a private threat had now spilled into the global arena, exposing Israel to scrutiny it had not anticipated. Yet the narrative battle raged fiercest in the media. Western outlets framed Traoré as reckless, painting his defiance as populist bravado rather than principled sovereignty. Headlines repeated the charge that democracy in West Africa was at risk, omitting the origin of the ultimatum itself. But this narrative found less traction than expected. African and Global South media outlets countered with a different framing, a leader under siege for refusing to sell his nation's resources on foreign terms. In this clash of interpretations, a phrase began to circulate beyond Africa: the Burkina Faso Revolution. It was not a revolution in the sense of coups or insurrections. It was a revolution of posture, of saying no where silence had long been the safer answer. It inspired debates in Latin America, in Asia, even in parts of Europe where smaller nations recalled their own struggles against domination. For Israel, the cost was not only diplomatic. The ultimatum meant to discipline one leader had instead drawn global attention to tactics once carried out discreetly. For the United States and Europe, the crisis risked exposing a double standard, proclaiming democracy while tolerating threats against an elected African government. For Africa itself, it marked the first moment in years when the continent's collective voice rang louder than the whispers of external approval. As the deadline drew near, the world watched. Would the international order punish a nation for defiance, or would it be forced to accept that the age of ultimatums was slipping away? The ultimatum expired, but the story did not end. When the clock struck the final hour and Ibrahim Traoré walked onto the balcony, flanked not by foreign guarantors but by his own people, a new chapter began. The question was no longer whether he would survive the 48 hours. The question was what would follow after defiance had been proven possible. The first path ahead was lined with risks. Sanctions were likely. Foreign investors would hesitate. Aid pipelines, already fragile, could be cut entirely. In the global system, refusal often carries a price. And for a nation with limited economic resilience, that price would be steep. Farmers would feel it in their harvests, traders and lowers in their ledgers, students in their opportunities. Resistance is not without cost, and every Burkinabe knew it. Yet alongside the risks were opportunities. The calls Traore had made in the darkest hours had planted seeds of new alliances. Caracas had promised sanctuary, Tehran cybersecurity, Moscow advisors, Beijing partnerships. But more significant than any foreign capital was the new posture within Africa itself. Leaders who once hesitated now found courage and precedent. The African Union was no longer debating an abstraction. It was preparing protocols of mutual defense against political interference. The Ouagadougou Protocol, born from crisis, had the potential to shift the balance of continental diplomacy. At home, the path forward was equally complex. Defiance had united the streets, but unity forged in crisis must be nurtured in calm. The coming months would test whether popular solidarity could translate into long-term reforms, fairer contracts, stronger institutions, investments in youth and technology. Without that transformation, resistance would risk becoming only a gesture, a moment remembered but not built upon. Traore himself faced a different test: how to transform symbolic victory into sustainable leadership. Defiance is powerful, but governance requires more: patience, compromise, strategy. Would he turn resistance into a doctrine of constructive independence, or would external pressure slowly grind his administration down? That question lingered like the Harmattan dust over the Sahel, visible yet unsettled. Still, hope surged stronger than fear. Across Burkina Faso, ordinary people began to imagine futures where sovereignty was not a word for speeches, but a reality in markets, schools, and fields. Artists painted murals of a clock shattering into sunlight. Musicians turned chants of 48 hours into anthems. Children learned that leadership could mean standing firm rather than bowing low. And beyond Burkina Faso, whispers turned into declarations. From Bamako to Accra, from Niamey to Cape Town, the ultimatum became a story retold in classrooms, coffee houses, and parliaments. Not as a tale of confrontation alone, but as evidence that the smallest nation could alter the largest equation. The road ahead was uncertain, littered with sanctions, pressures, and propaganda, but it was also open in ways it had not been before. And for a continent too often told that its destiny lay in the hands of others, that open road was itself a form of victory. As dawn broke after the 48-hour standoff, one question remained: would this defiance be remembered as a moment of resistance, or as the beginning of a journey towards a different future for Africa? The ultimatum was meant to reduce a nation to submission. Instead, it revealed something greater: that the strength of a people is not measured by the size of their armies or the weight of their treasuries, but by their refusal to surrender dignity. In those 48 hours, Burkina Faso proved that sovereignty is not gifted, it is claimed. The story began with a voice on the phone promising exile or surrender. It ended with a president standing on a balcony, surrounded by a sea of citizens who roared their answer: "We choose neither. We choose country. We choose dignity. We choose sovereignty." That night, the chants of Ouagadougou joined the great chorus of African history, from independence struggles to continental unity. Across Africa and beyond, the tale traveled. Leaders whispered its lessons, young people sang its rhythms, elders nodded in recognition. The ultimatum failed, but something else succeeded: a revolution of spirit. Not chaos, not violence, but a quiet, defiant reordering of the relationship between power and people. This was, in its own way, the Burkina Faso Revolution. Critics would still call it reckless. Others would label it dangerous. Yet the truth echoed louder: dignity cannot be reckless, sovereignty cannot be dangerous, independence cannot be negotiable. The phrase Ibrahim Traoré Coup was hurled as an accusation, yet it became a badge worn with pride by those who understood its meaning. A refusal to let foreign ultimatums dictate African futures. The Ibrahim Traoré Coup was not simply about one leader, it was about a people reclaiming their voice. And so the question now extends beyond Ouagadougou. If one small, landlocked nation could resist, what stops others? If 48 hours could shift the story of a continent, What could 48 months, 48 years, or a generation achieve? This is not the end of a confrontation. It is the beginning of a possibility that Africa can negotiate as equal, not supplicant. That sovereignty is not symbolic but real. That dignity, once defended, can inspire generations. If you believe these stories of resilience matter, matter, do not let them fade. Subscribe, share, and stand with us, because the struggle for dignity is not finished, and the next chapter belongs to all of us.